what to know before speaking to investors. And so this is primarily aimed at software founders, software startups and growth stage software startups that are out trying to raise capital to fund the growth of the business. And so I think it's a pretty good topic that has some pretty good nuggets in here for you. So we'll jump into it. First off, for those of you that don't know me, my name's Jeff Francis. I'm the founder of ENO8. ENO8's a digital innovation studio based here in Dallas, Texas. And I've personally worked on probably, it's actually probably closer to 200 plus software products over the last like 15 years. And so seen a lot of stuff and just happy to be able to share some of those experiences with you guys so that you can probably learn something from it. So let's start by just talking a little bit high level. A lot of you may already know these concepts, but I thought it would be worth reviewing briefly. Let's just talk about what are some of the different types of funding that we see software startups typically go towards. The first one here is bootstrapping. I kind of lump together bootstrapping and sort of like friends and family or sort of early angel kind of investing into one bucket. But generally speaking here, this is small raise or funding the business through the revenue of the business, right? So the probably purest definition of bootstrapping is that we're going to fund then further investment in the business by generating revenue from customers, right? Within that sort of same bucket, really early stage, oftentimes I would kind of throw in either self-funding, the founder is going to self-fund it to begin with, or potentially have some friends and family involved with funding there in the early stage. And then as you progress a little bit more, you might get into more of like a seed funding where these are still smaller investments. These might come from one person or one group, or maybe a collection of groups. There's a lot of like angel investing networks, especially here in the DFW area, a couple of really good ones. And so seed funding could come in that form early on. And then you get more into the venture style funding like Series A, B, C, D, which are typically larger raises, more formalized, more of an institutional type of investment that's focused more on venture, right? So that's kind of a bird's eye look at the different types of funding, right? And if we think about when you're getting ready to go out and talk to investors, the barriers to funding sort of fall within kind of two main categories, I think. And keep in mind, a lot of the stuff that I'm going to be talking about today, by the way, is going to be from the product standpoint, right? So there's a lot of really good people, especially in the DFW ecosystem, that can kind of help with more of your pure business plan and your pitch. This is sort of a subset of that aimed at the product, right? Because one of the biggest investments, if not the biggest investment with a software startup, is building the software. And so that's kind of where I'm going to focus a lot of the conversation today. Anyway, back to the barriers. So we put these sort of in two different buckets. Either concerns with the founders or the founding team or the founder, or concerns with the product, which in that bucket I would put sort of the product / primary business concept, right? And so today's discussion is going to be centered around gaining clarity and how clarity can remove both of these barriers. And so if we start with barrier number one, I'll talk about this one briefly. This is, concerns with founders. And while I probably can't make you more likable in terms of talking to investors, I can promise that your confidence increases in correlation with your level of clarity about what you're setting out to do, right? And so what I'm kind of getting at on this point is that it goes a long way to remove a barrier of a concern with a founder when they are very clear, they have a high level of confidence associated with what they're trying to do, they have good answers around what they're trying to do, and they have a very clear plan, right? And so I'll talk about this slide a couple of different times here, where we talk about clarity creates confidence, and then confidence helps to fuel funding. And so in terms of addressing the barrier of a concern with the founder, like I said, having a founder that has very good, concise answers, good information and backing behind their answers, that creates a lot of confidence for the founder, but also confidence in the eyes of the investor by having that level of clarity, right? If we jump to barrier number 2, this would be, more in the bucket of concerns with the product itself or the plan for building the product and launching the product, right? And so some of the concerns that investors might have at this point could be, them question themselves, is this product going to fail, right? Like what, a high likelihood of new products fail. And so they're thinking, what's the likelihood that this product is actually going to be successful? Another sample could be, is this product unique enough? Is there something already that's serving this purpose? Is the competition too crowded? Will this stand out from the crowd? So, you got to think about is this really a unique product and does it have something different to offer in the marketplace? And then, another question that would be pretty common would be, will this product be adopted or loved by the users, right? So if you think about, back to investor fears, you guys have all seen a lot of statistics similar to this. There's one that we plucked from Forbes that talks about that, 90% of startups fail, right? And so if you're thinking about, talking to an investor, they probably are aware of this, right? And they understand that, they've got to take into account what's the probability of success, and they're really going to scrutinize your concept a whole lot, right? So if we think about what do they want, what are they looking for? Investors are really looking to manage, reduce, or eliminate risk, right? That's kind of what it comes down to. And risk is born or grows in the unknown, especially, right? And so I kind of have a saying that clarity is the antidote to risk. The more clear you have about things, the better decisions you can make, reducing the risk, you have a better plan. So clarity is a great antidote to risk overall. Just if you think about it, the concept of creating something totally new is going to be inherently, risky and uncertain. And so really the only proven way to address that uncertainty is to create a plan, take action on it, and show that you're able to meet those objectives, right? And the more that you can sort of lay out a plan and hit that plan, that builds confidence in the eyes of investors. And so, you don't have to reinvent the plan. There's frameworks. At ENO8, we've got a really good one. A big part of that is our innovation lab. But having a proven process or structure, sort of work your concept through so that you get that clarity and get that plan, is a really good way to go about it. And so we'll talk about some of the things that we do on that I think will help you here in just a second. So, again, clarity creates confidence. So on the product front, right, getting clear about your product, who the users are, why it's going to be valuable, how you're going to build it, how much is it going to cost, how long is it going to take, what kind of team do I need, what's the technology we're going to use. All those kinds of things go together to help create high degree of clarity, which helps boost confidence, which then will serve you well when you're having these conversations with investors. And so I've kind of broken the presentation down into 10 questions that you need to feel very comfortable answering before you actually start seeking capital, before you actually start having these conversations with investors, right? And I've split them into sort of two different sections. The first one that we're going to talk about is more like product vision questions, right? These are more high level, like what's the product going to serve, right? And so what I would usually expect is when you're talking to investors, that probably the first meaningful conversation is going to be more around the vision and the product and the problem you're solving, that kind of thing. And then perhaps in that same conversation, but later in the conversation or in a separate conversation that comes after, you'll get into more of the details around how are you going to build it and how long is it going to take and the specifics of building it. But I would expect that up front, you're probably going to get more of the product vision type of questions, right? And so the first question that we're going to review is, who are the end users? Are you really clear on who is the product for? Who's actually going to be using it? And, another question that goes along with that I'll mention is, who's going to be buying the product? And is this different than the person that's going to be using the product? And that may sound like a funny question, but I'll explain. So sometimes the person purchasing the software or purchasing or using the product is the same as the decision maker, right? So think like a B2C type of product, a marketplace or social media app, those kinds of things. The person using it is the person who decides whether they want to use it in most cases, right? But if you think more like a B2B type of scenario, the user that's going to be using the product may not be the person that is making the decision to buy it. And so you need to be mindful of both of these types of users or both of these sort of targets, right, or personas when thinking about your product. Because I've seen examples in the past where there was a product that was really good for the end user and they really liked it, but there wasn't an economic benefit, for example, big enough for the person who would actually need to make the decision to purchase it to decide to invest in it. And so you want to think about both of those as you're trying to gain clarity around who's the end user, who's the person who's going to really benefit from this, who's getting the value from the product, right? Number two is something I talk a lot about, and I think it's really important. I think it's a big distinction, especially in building software today. But why will my users really love my product, right? So, for example, what's the problem that it solves? What's the value that it brings? What is it about the product that's going to make it really compelling for somebody to use it? And one of the ways that I talk about this concept is in the MLP, or Minimum Lovable Product, versus MVP, Minimum Viable Product. Many of you have heard of MVP. That's a pretty common concept. But MLP, a lot of people haven't heard of. So the main distinction is that the MVP is very focused on the product. Like, what features should we put in this? What's the minimum set of features that we could ship a version 1 of this product with? An MLP is really focused on the user. And the reason why that's important is because if you want the product to be successful, you have to make sure that the users are really going to love it for some reason. And we call it a minimum lovable product because it may not need to be really big and complex right out of the gate, even if your vision for the product is quite large. What you can do is try to see if you can reduce it down to what is the minimum lovable version of the product, where we know that we can ship something that's fairly small, but is lovable by the users, meaning it solves a problem that's compelling, it's easy to use, there's a good user experience, it provides value. Like, what is the thing or things that make this a lovable product? And then try to boil that to what's the minimum lovable product that you can ship with. So when you're thinking about what does version 1 look like, think MLP, not MVP, right? Number 3 is, what's the broader disruptive agenda that my product fits into? This isn't a requirement, but it certainly helps. What I've seen is a lot of the products that have been most successful that we've worked on is their product has somehow gotten behind or actually in front of some sort of new wave or disruptive agenda that their story sort of fits into, right? And, I can give a small example of a client we worked with several years ago where their product was it needed to be able to super scale, collect a large amount of data, all within a short amount of time, like a small time window. It had a lot of users, thousands of users, and then they needed to be able to collapse it down after the data collection was done. And one of the most important things to their customers was being able to verify data accuracy, right? And so as we went through the innovation lab, one of the things that came up that could be really good is there might be a way to incorporate blockchain functionality to help verify that their data was completely correct and that there was a track record of how it got collected and that it didn't get edited or changed along the way. And so that theme, as they started to go talk to investors and even customers, fit really well. It was a great tailwind for them, because not only did they have a good product that fit and met a really compelling need, but it also had this big theme behind it that a lot of people were really interested in. So think about, does your product have a story, or does it fit within some sort of big disruptive theme or agenda that's going on? Number 4 is what's the key differentiating feature that we can launch with? This is a little bit similar to what I talked about a moment ago on MLP. So I think you need to think about what is it about the product that really makes it distinctive? Not just is this useful, but what makes it distinctive in the marketplace or in the universe of alternative options for your target users, right? So if they're not using your product, how are they going to do it elsewhere, right? And so you need to be aware of what would people do if this product didn't exist. How do we differentiate from other similar products that might already be in the marketplace? And do we feel like we can actually get out there and stand out in a way that makes us look distinct and different? And don't think about it just immediately coming out of the gate. Make sure you think about this longer term too. So an example that has a little bit of relevancy to this is I've seen people build software products before that are very dependent on some other product. This is just an example. So maybe it's an add-on for some big product. Think like a Salesforce or something like that. They can build some sort of an add-on product. Sometimes I've seen this with mobile apps that were, it's less common these days, but in the early days of the App Store, you'd see apps that were actually really interesting and useful, but they were really just a feature. And along the way, Apple would just incorporate it into their iOS operating system, right? And then as soon as they do that, your product's sort of obsolete. And so as you're looking at these things, be aware of your dependency on someone else's product or ecosystem, and sort of what is it that makes this product able to really stand on its own legs and be a true product that's standalone over the long term. And, it depends on your goals. For some people, they want a lifestyle business, and having a smaller business that is dependent on another product is completely fine. So not knocking that. I've seen some really good businesses that go that route, but you want to be very clear about it, right, as you're starting out. Number 5 is, what will it look like? And then I kind of mentioned this may not be a prototype, right? So this question is really cutting at how clearly and how well can you communicate the vision to the investors and to the other stakeholders, even the dev team, designers, testers, other people on the team. Like how well can you communicate the vision? And there are some tools that help with that. I cited an example here on Design Prototype because it's one of my sort of personal favorites when it comes to helping clarify the vision for the product, just because you can see it, and it's a pretty lightweight, fairly cost-effective way to get clarity around like the product vision. What we're building this, who are we building for? What would it actually look like if somebody saw it and they start using it? And so spend time making sure that you can really clearly communicate that vision of what the product does, who it's for, how it would function, that kind of thing, because sometimes that can be a little bit hard to explain. And when appropriate, a design prototype can be a really useful tool in that goal, right? So now we're going to tilt into the second half of the 10 questions, and these are going to move a little bit more towards like execution style questions, like how are we actually going to do this, right? So number 6 is, how much will it cost to build? Of course, everybody wants to know this, right? And along with how much is it going to cost to build is how long will it take? Those two really go hand in hand. And you would be surprised how many times when you talk to a founder and ask them, how much money do you need for the development? There's some real cookie cutter answer, like we need $100,000 and we're going to hire 3, remote developers, and that's how we're going to do the development, right? And be careful with that, because a lot of the investors I talk to, they hear that sort of cookie cutter answer so often that they automatically know that means they don't really know what the cost is going to be. It's sort of a guess, right? And so another thing that you'll find is a lot of times founders have put together information on their vision. Maybe they've created some sort of requirements document or maybe a slide deck or something along those lines. And then they start talking to software development companies to get estimates, right? And usually what will happen in that process is the numbers will be all over the place, right? And there's a lot of reasons behind that. And I think there's another ENO8 Answers, certainly blog posts that we've written about it before that goes into great detail on why that is. So if you're interested, go check those out. But at a high level, there's just a lot of variation in terms of how people arrive at those numbers, right? How deeply are your requirements really fleshed out? What kind of assumptions are being made? Where's the development being done? What kind of people are involved with this? What corners are you cutting, whether you know it or not, in order to get that number? And so Is it going to be built from scratch? Is there parts of it that can use things that are off the shelf or leverage some of the like AWS products, for example, right? A lot of the things that you would have to build on your own 10 years ago, you don't have to build on your own anymore. There's a product that you can use for that to get started. And so, the other thing along cost is, like how clear are you on sort of the milestones and the roadmap? What actually are you going to build in what phases, and how did you sort of come up with those numbers? So this is a really important one, and you're probably not going to get reliable numbers by writing all your requirements down on a Word doc and circulating it around to a bunch of development shops. I would recommend that you need to do something that's a little bit more in depth than that to actually get to a number that you can have some confidence in. Which, back to our confidence creating clarity topic, if you can demonstrate how you came up with those numbers, you're in a much better position than being the founder that says, I need $100,000 to hire 3 part-time devs, right? Number 7 is, what type of technology will I need to build it? And is it even feasible? This one probably was a lot more relevant several years ago. I'm hearing from a lot of founders that less and less of the focus in the conversations is around like what's their tech stack and what's the technology they're going to use to build it. But I do think that you need to have a clear answer to what are you going to use to build this, and the concept or what you're trying to achieve with the software. How do you have confidence that that is feasible? Because a lot of the greatest products, when you identify what the concept is for it, and you talk about what the product will do, it may be on the edge of like whether you really know whether it's feasible or not. And technology is changing so fast that what may not be feasible now might be feasible in 6 months, for example. And AI is a really good example of one of those that's happening like that right now. We've all seen a lot of the different AI products out there, and if you use them now, they're very different than they looked 6 months ago or a year ago. They've gotten better really, really fast. And so, evaluating what's the technology, what are we going to use, how are we going to approach building this, and knowing, is it truly feasible? Or if you're not sure about feasibility, do you have a plan for how do you sort of build proof of concepts or test along the way to ensure that you can kind of validate that your approach will work before you get too deep into it, right? Number 8 is, what type of team will it take to build this? I've talked a lot about what kinds of teams make sense in different scenarios, what roles need to be covered, what types of partners or resources do you need at different stages. So if this is a topic of interest to you, we've got a lot of other information on this that you can check out, and feel free to ping me on LinkedIn or send me an email, and I can point you to some of those. But let's talk a little bit more real generally, right? So if you think about real broadly, there's kind of 3 different buckets or 3 different big options. One is usually and we're talking about startups. So one is, using freelancers out of the gate, like hiring a freelancer or several freelancers to work on helping you build it. In that same bucket, I would sort of put founders that are maybe technical that try to build it on their own at first. That's a whole other topic that I can get into. The second bucket is more of a small development shop or studio. Think like a boutique firm, right? So they probably are working with more startups and small to medium-sized businesses. And then you have the really big consulting firms. And those are usually not a very good fit for startups. Their minimum budget for project sizes and just their cost to value ratio for a startup isn't something that usually has a good fit. So that's usually not even an option that very many startups, evaluate very seriously. So we're really kind of talking about the first 2 buckets, either the freelance route or sort of a small agency or small studio, right? And then there's other things that go on top of this, like what roles do I need covered? A common mistake is that people will assume that they just need developers. I want to build software, so I need developers. And so they'll just have developers involved. But if you do that, a lot of times there are problems that you may not become aware of very early on that could really plague you later. And one of our previous ENO8 Answers, we talked about a concept called the essential trio, right? If you haven't seen that, go check it out. It talks very specifically about some of the real core 3 roles that you need to cover whenever you're building a product, not necessarily by having a full-time role for that, but you need someone who's an expert in those 3 areas. And I'll mention them just briefly. You need someone that's in the The product visionary role, you need someone who is in the UX strategy role, and you need someone who's in the technical lead role. And there's other people, there's other resources that you will definitely need, but those three, that sort of trifecta there, you have to have good coverage from people who are really good at those roles in order to really cut out the risk, right? And just build a really awesome product. So go check that out if you're interested in diving deeper on that. But so being clear on what those different roles are, and then another factor to think about is, well, where are the resources going to be? Am I going to work with local resources, here in the U.S. or even like local to your city? Are you going to go remote, and still work with U.S. resources? Will you go near shore, like Latin America, South America, that kind of thing? Or are you going to go with more of an offshore model, think like India, or not really offshore, but a lot of resources in Europe that are really good, right? So understanding what your approach is going to be will impact cost a whole lot, but it's also going to impact your strategy for how you approach building the product. So getting clarity around, this is the type of team that I'm going to use. This is where they are. And this is kind of how we're going to configure that. These are the different roles on the team. That type of clarity is going to help you a whole lot when talking about how you're actually going to execute on building this. Number 9 is, do we have a clear launch and release plan, right? And along with that, do we have success metrics for each of those stages, right? And so if we think about what is a launch or a release plan, it could be something as simple as being very clear about what your minimum lovable product is and being focused on launching that MLP, right? Now, when you launch the MLP, you need to know what are your key success criteria, or what are your key, we call them minimum viable analytics, right? Or MVAs. And so when you do launch your product, what are the key success metrics that you're going to be looking at to know whether you are achieving what you set out to do? That could be number of active users, that could be number of new subscriptions, that could be a revenue volume of purchasing through the platform. It could vary greatly based on what your product does and who it's for, but you need to have, at least that 2 to 5 different metrics that are really, really critical for you to gauge, are we being successful or not, right? And think about it this way, if you're talking to investors too, having that clarity around these are the things that we're going to measure, and these are the important metrics that we're going to be hitting, right? If you think about, if you're able to set that up and identify that before building and launching the product, you build and launch the product, and you're on track or even off track slightly on those metrics, that starts to build that confidence, right? And it builds a track record that you can point to later. Now, if we extend this beyond just the initial release to talk more about a release plan, the release plan could be sort of your roadmap of, here's the features and functionality that we know that we want to include in the product, but it just didn't make it into the MLP, right? And sometimes you'll launch the MLP and you'll go into more of a maintenance mode where you're just monitoring, maybe fixing bugs, that kind of thing, to get the validation from your metrics before you continue product development. Other times it might make more sense to launch the product and continue on the next phase or the next release on your roadmap, right? So having that clarity of what's in the MLP, why is that what we're choosing, what's on the roadmap, and sort of broadly, when would those things potentially be released? And sometimes they're not just time dependent, sometimes they're metric or objective dependent. So if we don't have success on these metrics during the MLP launch, then we would not move forward with the second version, for instance, right? So being clear about what are those validation gates or those success criteria for each of those stages of your roadmap is really important. And then starting to wrap up here, if we talk about question number 10, this is more of a broad question. Now, knowing what we've talked about kind of in this presentation, some of these questions that you need to make sure that you're really clear about, do you feel equipped with the product clarity yourself that you need to start raising capital and actually talking to investors? And it's okay if the answer is no. If the answer is no, you just circle back and figure out where your holes are and have a plan for getting those shored up so that you can now feel confident that when you go have those conversations, you're going to make the most of that opportunity when you start to talk to them, right? So just to recap, clarity creates confidence. Confidence fuels funding. You can get a lot of that confidence by being more clear about some of the real critical information and items associated with your plan. Just a resource here if this helps. Here's, examples of some useful artifacts that we actually create as part of our innovation lab that we think really helps people get really clear about their product, what they're going to build and what's it going to take to build it, that kind of thing. Some of the things that we do during the lab phase is we help you get clear on your user personas. We get clear on the user journey, which that really does a good job of informing where the pain points and the opportunities are for the users and what features should be built and sort of that roadmap concept we talked about. Wireframes will help a lot because you start to actually clarify that vision around what is this going to look like. Taking it even a step further, the clickable prototype is another one that I'll mention here, where you can really do a good job of communicating the product and the vision to lots of different stakeholders that kind of speak different languages by using a prototype. And then, the architecture brief, that's a broad term for, a lot of the technical decisions that you need to make. What's the architecture? What's the stack? What's the infrastructure look like? Are we going to have to integrate with products? A lot of that kind of clarity comes from creating that type of artifact. I have user stories mentioned here, but over time, we've actually shifted a little bit away from prioritizing user stories during the lab. And instead, we focus more on epic level or feature level estimates where we're looking at the different feature sets and the associated effort to build those features so that you can help make a better decision on prioritization, right? So those are some artifacts that can be pretty useful. If you want some additional resources, check out our other ENO8 Answers videos. We base those largely off of conversations that we have with prospective customers and other founders. And that's where a lot of those topics come from. And so go check that out. You can find it at eno8.com/eno8-answers. There's a bunch of videos out there, so check that out. I didn't mention it here, but our blog also has a lot of good stuff. But the ENO8 Answers videos are pretty rich, and I think there's a lot of good stuff in there that can help you. If you want to reach out to me, if there's ever anything I can do to help, if you have questions or even feedback on the episode today, I would love to hear from you, whether that means you love it and you got a lot out of it, or you thought it was terrible and you want to tell me how terrible it is. I invite the feedback either way. It'd be much appreciated. Feel free to email me at jeff@eno8.com, or I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. So there's my LinkedIn address. You can connect with me on LinkedIn or shoot me a message over there. And with that, I think that's all for today's episode. Thanks for watching, and good luck on your product development efforts. Let us know if there's any way that we can help you.